Hi, this is Johanna Bockman, and I'm going to talk about my paper, Thinking Foucault Through Yugoslavia, Socialist Banking, Neoliberalism, and Capitalism. Michel Foucault argued that neoliberal governmentality mobilizes the market to govern populations and discipline the soul. Through these mechanisms, entrepreneurial rationality colonizes the political sphere and the individual. Following Foucault, some scholars have suggested that state socialism in Eastern Europe and worker self-management socialism in Yugoslavia were neoliberal because of their use of the market. Yet for anti-authoritarian socialists like those in Yugoslavia, direct democracy was supposed to spread to all realms, thus demonstrating another kind of rationality, a socialist rationality. These anti-authoritarian socialists also advocated the use of the market and the building of socialist institutions like socialist banks to enable a socialist governmentality. This talk develops Foucault's understanding of socialist governmentality in dialogue with Karl Polanyi's vision of socialism and the case of Yugoslav socialist banking. So my first part is on Foucault on neoliberalism. For Foucault, governmentality is the way in which one conducts the conduct of men. In the 1930s, German and Austrian neoliberals created the idea of neoliberalism as a new kind of socialism. For Foucault, the essence of neoliberalism is the market colonizing the state. Foucault defines neoliberalism as the adoption, quote, of the free market as the organizing and regulating principle of the state. Liberalism's laissez-faire approach is replaced by the neoliberal state's permanent vigilance, activity, and intervention. Thus, neoliberalism is not the presence of the free market, but the governance of society, or in other words, management of the conduct of individuals and populations for the market, which is also, in his words too, the governmentality of society on the model of the enterprise. Foucault understands neoliberalism as the renewal of capitalism and liberalism. At the same time, Foucault denies that socialism has its own art of government or governmentality. Foucault asserts, quote, what socialism lacks is not so much a theory of the state as a governmental reason. And then he also says, I do not think that there is an autonomous socialist governmentality, and concludes that it must be invented. Post-war social democrats and socialists could then choose from a variety of governmentalities, according to Foucault, such as administrative rationality of the police state, totalitarianism, or the governmentality of the party, he calls it, liberal governmentalities, or neoliberal governmentality. So according to Foucault, both socialism and capitalism could be neoliberal, and a socialist governmentality might be invented. Numerous scholars have portrayed actually existing socialisms as neoliberal or proto-neoliberal. In his study of Czechoslovak technocrats, Gil has demonstrated that neoliberalism emerged independently from capitalism and out of East European socialism and its emerging class alliances. Ayal has suggested that neoliberalism is not necessarily capitalist, but rather an art of governance possible under a variety of economic systems. Scholars are currently debating whether post-Maoist China, with its market reforms, has been a form of neoliberal governmentality. Also, I just want to say as an aside, while Ayal and I had argued in 2002 that socialist economists became neoliberal before 1989, I've argued since that socialist economists practiced neoclassical economics, but were not necessarily neoliberal. So thus I see that there is a socialist governmentality or socialist governmentalities during this period. So scholars have argued that there is a socialist governmentality. Drawing on Foucault, Stephen Kotkin and Stephen Collier argue that this Soviet art of governance was not neoliberal at all, but illiberal. This illiberal category also includes, according to them, the welfare state, the developmental state, and the fascist state. So Kotkin and Collier understand socialism as having, in the words of Anna Krylova, fixed fundamentals. There's a fixed nature. So neoliberal governmentality could only arrive after the end of socialism, and it arrived from abroad as a foreign thing. In more economics approaches, scholars of China have argued that post-Mao China has forged what they call a neo-socialist governmentality, a revival of socialism through new forms of freedom, subjectivity, and control. This is very much influenced by Foucault as well. We also have more general statements about state socialist governmentality as being in the literature as being fixed or illiberal, authoritarian, or totalitarian. In contrast, other scholars have understood socialist governmentality as different from neoliberalism and as changing as a result of radical democratic movements and experiments. Zhivka Valia-Vicharska notes that Foucault was, quote, obviously not aware of post-Stalinist theories of social or socialist governance. Studying Bulgaria, Valia-Vicharska demonstrates the ways that socialist governance changed over time. This change came as a result of, quote, 2 decades of struggles by a diverse democratic socialist movement endeavoring to undo socialism's link to authoritarian power and to reimagine socialist governance through democratic pluralism and freedom of intellectual thought. Gal Kern similarly views socialist governmentality in Yugoslavia as changing from a revolutionary socialism based on the partisan to the exhaustion of worker self-management socialism to, by the mid-1980s, there was a possibility of what he calls a different democratic socialism was possible, and to a degree it was practiced relatively successfully. Krylova goes further to argue that, in fact, socialist governance changed throughout the Soviet era in the Soviet Union. The co-optation of socialist ideas by authoritarians has a long history, going back, maybe we could even say, far before Napoleon III and Bismarck's so-called socialism. Anti-authoritarian socialists have sought a socialist governmentality uniquely defined by workers' power and expansive democracy. Soviets, workers' councils, and communes practice a form of socialist governance, a form of governance based on direct democracy. Foucault misses the unique role of democracy in socialist governmentality because he focuses so much on markets and entrepreneurialism, and he overlooks the neoliberals' panic about democracy. In the 1930s and the 1920s and the early 1930s in Austria, when neoliberals were developing their ideas, capitalists sought to stop workers from introducing socialism either through elections, through the expansion of the franchise in 1907 and again after World War I, or they also sought to realize socialism through democracy. They also sought to introduce socialism through armed worker uprisings. Neoliberals presented the economy as a separate sphere with its own economic motives, which in the minds of neoliberals should be protected from the state and thus protected from this expanding and radicalized democracy. Neoliberals worked and continue to work in quite obvious ways to limit democracy. Foucault did not perceive neoliberals' obsessive fear of democracy and thus did not recognize its unique part in socialist governmentality. So now I turn to my next part, which is about Karl Polanyi's vision of socialism and democracy. In 1934, Karl Polanyi wrote, "Either democracy or capitalism must go. Fascism is that solution of the deadlock which leaves capitalism untouched. The other solution is socialism. Capitalism goes, democracy remains." Polanyi believed that capitalism and democracy were mutually incompatible, while socialism required democracy and democracy required socialism. In 1922, in a debate with neoliberal Ludwig von Mises, Polanyi laid out his vision of socialism, which involved the abolition of private ownership of the means of production. It involved the participation of all people in a variety of producer associations, cooperatives, and communes, the ownership of the means of production by communes, the right to use the means of production to the employees of producer organizations and cooperatives, and a radical democratic decision-making on all technical and social justice concerns. In contrast to viewing producers and consumers as different actors on a market, Polanyi based his ideas on the rich associational life in Red Vienna, in which individuals participated in a range of associations reflecting their many identities across the economy and the polity. For Polanyi, markets have existed throughout human history and are an instrument for socialism. He wrote that socialism would have markets in what he called commodities in the proper sense of the term. So not fictitious commodities of land, labor, or money, and that these would help ensure the freedom of the consumer to indicate the shifting of demand to influence producers' income and to serve as an instrument of accountancy. Thus, Polanyi opposed the market as a society run by markets, but not markets. He didn't oppose markets or exchange. Croatian political scientist Danijela Dolenec and philosopher Mislav Žitko have laid out a similar socialist governmentality. They build this socialist governmentality by combining Elinor Ostrom's vision of the commons and Yugoslav worker self-management as presented by Branko Horvat. They envision a system that would be egalitarian, radically democratic, sustainable, and socialist. They assume the end of private ownership of the means of production is merely the first step, because further steps need to be taken to stop the etatization of socialism and the reestablishment of class hierarchy. Radical democracy is needed to do this. The Yugoslav case is an important example of socialist governmentality. However, Dolenec and Žitko view worker self-management as beyond state and market, as not including the state or the market. However, Yugoslav worker self-management from the beginning combined markets and worker self-management as a way to move beyond bureaucratized state socialism to communism. Yugoslav leaders, especially Kardelj and Kidrić, had been Trotskyists since at least 1946. Their plan included, in Susan Woodward's words, control of the plan from below, especially for consumption, by both market demand and democratic participation. This model was not created in Yugoslavia or in the Soviet Union or by Polanyi, but was discussed throughout Eastern Europe and around the world during at least the 1920s and 1930s, if not earlier. In the 1960s, the Yugoslav government implemented both the expanded autonomy of enterprises and the expansion of markets. However, various groups had long called for the extension of worker self-management beyond the enterprises. For example, the trade unions, in the words of Nigel Swain, argued for, quote, the system of workers' councils should be extended vertically to become, in effect, a separate chamber of parliament. According to Suvin, conservatives were suspicious of worker self-management and became invested in political oligarchy. So these conservatives isolated worker self-management in the enterprises and let it die, while expanding the market and banking at the republic levels. With the disintegration of the federal state, republic leaders turned to authoritarian nationalism and allied with republican banks and international financial capital. In spite of these limitations, Yugoslavia's experiment in socialist governmentality had and has global significance because it tested many socialist ideas and socialist governmentality discussed worldwide. Now to my third point, third section on socialist banking. Now, the idea of socialist banking is entirely problematic because capital is obviously a fictitious economy and capital markets are probably not socialist at all. So I argue that Yugoslav economists worked to build new kinds of banks that would create and control capital outside international financial centers as a kind of socialist financial globalization and as a way to enable socialist governmentality. According to Rusinow, the new Yugoslav banking laws in the 1960s sought to remove banks from the state sector and motivate enterprises to save and thus provide investment capital. This capital was not individualized private accumulation, but social property. Rusinow writes that this law, quote, represented the first serious attempt by a socialist state to find a viable alternative to either traditional capitalist or traditional socialist methods of capital accumulation and mobilization. These banks were not organized by Yugoslavia and other places as international financial capitalist institutions, but rather as another set of socialist institutions supporting socialist governmentality in the service of production, export, solidarity, and radical democracy. On January 1st, 1980, the Yugoslav Bank for International Economic Cooperation, UBMIS, began operations as a socialist bank and as a non-aligned bank. It originally had started in 1956 as Jugobanka, a commercial bank financing Yugoslav exports. In 1968, the Export Credit and Insurance Fund replaced it and provided supplementary credit financing, which provided money to Yugoslav banks financing Yugoslav companies to export their products. And it also provided insurance against various political risks. The Yugoslav Bank for International Economic Cooperation added a third task when it opened in 1980, international financial cooperations. According to its founding law, this bank was created to realize the goals of the 1976 Non-Aligned Summit in Colombo, Sri Lanka. The bank was also organized as a self-managed socialist bank, reflecting worker self-management socialism at the time. The founders and members of this bank were organizations of associated labor, which produced and exported capital goods, such as those companies that were building ships and machinery, and they created this as an association, this bank. By the mid-1980s, there were over 200 members of this bank, comprising Yugoslav producers, exporters, and commercial banks, which were the main source of funding to run the bank, and they also were the ones running the self-management committees. So it was organized as a self-managed socialist bank. The bank opened at the beginning of the 1980s debt crisis, in the worldwide debt crisis, and sought alternatives to capital markets. The bank supported alternative payment ideas, so they were into the payment of claims and raw materials. They were interested in barter. They were interested in breaking up claims into different kinds of trades. They were talking about repayment of exports in other currencies. They were using this to think about mutual investments and cooperation, and all these different kinds of ways to avoid financial markets and to continue trade flowing. Yugoslav officials understood this bank and its strategy for working during the debt crisis as part of a broader non-aligned strategy that had been thought about for a long time. One official with this global financial vision was Dragoslav Avramovich. Since the beginning of his career, Avramovich had been working on policies to deal with debt and finance. Avramovich led work in intergovernmental organizations and Yugoslav organizations to continue the realization of the new international economic order and to create non-aligned financial institutions. He and his colleagues argued that the global South required what he called its own financial base, and began detailed planning of new institutions for international finance and monetary cooperation. Non-aligned economists around Avramovich sought to reduce dependence on the global North and to, quote, to create a monetary and financial infrastructure within the South, which would facilitate trade, aid, investment, and other forms of cooperative economic endeavor to expedite the economic and social development of these countries. To realize what they called an autonomous South, economists at the 1976 Non-Aligned Summit in Colombo made plans for a bank for the developing countries, a new currency, and a developing countries payment union. In 1986, Avramovich again laid out his broader vision. In addition to increased barter and something like raw material cartels, his strategy required finance under the control of the participants, so finance controlled by the banks in the South. First, one of the ideas was the Bank of Developing Countries, called the South Bank, which would start with OPEC funds to provide funding for commodity agreements and joint ventures between developing countries. Second, the Third World Bank was another idea, would be a consortium of private and public banks in the global South and would concentrate on increasing trade among developing countries. This was in line with UNCTAD's long-time vision of economic cooperation among developing countries. This bank would provide short-term funds to enable trade, funds that were severely lacking during the debt crisis. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, advocates of financial cooperation, like Abramovich, hoped that these institutions would help expand mutual trade, encourage mutual investment and joint ventures, solve balance of payment problems, and create a new economy, one that would be neither capitalist nor neo-imperialist, and these banks would hopefully enable a socialist governmentality or multiple socialist governmentalities. This talk has developed Foucault's understanding of socialist governmentality in dialogue with Karl Polanyi's vision of socialism and the case of Yugoslav socialist banking. Drawing on Polanyi, I presented socialist governmentality as founded in radical democracy. This socialist governmentality emerges in various moments, as in Red Vienna and in Valia Vicharska's discussion of Bulgarian Marxist humanist circles. We also Gal Kern's mid-1980s Yugoslavia and its new ideas about democracy and civil society, and many other cases and situations. Socialist non-aligned banking was also an attempt to try to do another form of socialist, try to allow for the expansion of socialist governmentalities and avoid the logic of international capital markets. The struggles of these groups to realize anti-authoritarian forms of socialism and to create new forms of socialism came with many contradictions and difficulties. Despite these contradictions and difficulties, these are attempts to further develop socialist governmentality. As Nikolai Kharkov has demonstrated, socialist Eastern Europe has been a site of autonomous socialist theoretical production. And it is important to recognize this and not to forget this in very important history. Understanding this radical democratic governmentality as unique to socialism is important for understanding the nature of neoliberal governmentality, as well as for developing future experiments in socialist governmentality. Thank you.